For the last few weeks, I've been doing a bunch of testing on really small motors, and I thought it would be interesting to show what it looks like on the bench if you put a way too big prop on it. And these are nice and small motors, so they're going to burn really easily. They don't have the thermal capacity that a normal full-size motor does. So in these graphs, we're looking at two different props on the same motor. I've got a normal prop in blue, one that you would typically put on a motor of this size, and the overload is a much bigger, much more aggressive prop. So it's a prop that makes a lot more thrust, but it also pulls a lot more amps. So we can kind of see the character of what it looks like when we're burning a motor, and maybe that can inform a bit if we're looking at similar charts as we're coming close to burning a motor, to be able to identify that a little easier. So in this first chart, we're looking at the RPM of the test, and you can see the blue line. Now this is not an unloaded motor, this is with a normal prop on it. So we're hitting like 35,000 RPM, and you can see how much more of a load this much heavier prop is putting on there. We're almost down to half the RPM of the already loaded motor on the normal one. In very low RPM, you can kind of, if you look at the angle of this curve, they're not too far off. Obviously the load is a little lower there, but it actually starts to taper. The overloaded motor really tapers a lot more significantly after like the first half a second into the test. So we can already see the motor starting to be unhappy at really low power, and it's struggling to get its RPM up. We've got a nice clean, kind of consistent arc up and a sharp point up to peak thrust before it begins to drag out. But here it slopes more and more. We've got a kind of a lumpy top end of the throttle. It starts curving even further, and then we don't have as sharp a point, and it really starts to sag more aggressively than the normal one does. Right here, at just before 6 seconds into the test, this is where the coil burns. So you can see we have a little drop off in RPM, and then it falls off a cliff. So our initial desync happens right there, and then right at the very end of the test, it gets the motor ramped up a little bit, just barely up to idle speed, before it reaches the end and then falls off it. And after this this test was run, the motor would not sync again. It wouldn't idle, wouldn't spin up, so it was completely fried at this point. If you look at the thrust with the overloaded prop at very low RPM, we actually were making more thrust than the less aggressive prop. But because the load was so heavy, you can see how the thrust that we get tapered off very rapidly. Again, right about here is where the RPM, you could tell that they started to diverge a lot more, and that's right where the thrust begins to pick up on the normally sized prop on this motor. So in the end, the peak power on the normal prop is actually a lot higher than the overloaded prop, even before the motor fails. This is the amp draw for the test, and you can see right there before that 6 second, here's that first desync event right there. We're running steady at about 15 amps. Compared to the normal one, we're at like 12.5 amps, and we've got another like 2.5 amps of peak draw. At that first desync event, we get another 2.5, 3 amp peak, and then right at the end, so this is that section where that RPM, if we go back and look at the RPM graph, right here where this begins to taper just slightly, and then we have another huge spike in amp draw as the coil melts up to like 21, 22 amps. And then as the ESC detects the desync, it stops driving the motor, and then our current draw drops to nothing. It attempts to resync shortly after, right at the 6 second mark, but doesn't get it spinning because we saw the RPM was just flat all through here. The RPM is just tailing off. Right at 6 seconds here, it tried to start it up again, but absolutely no effect, and it was just coasting down. And then towards the end, we have this stepped, like, attempt at a recovery. The amp draw draws up quite a bit, actually, to almost 8 amps, but very little effect. Again, we're not even getting back up to idle RPM, and you can look at the amp draw for the idle section is almost nothing. So we're dumping a ton of amp into the motor to get very little speed. So this is all completely desynced through there, and the motor is just not going to come up again. We can also see the effect of that desync event in the efficiency charts. The normal chart has an efficiency graph like we're used to seeing, where it comes up and then we have our sustained throttle portion. We have a lot more samples on. And we have the same basic look to the chart there, and the short sustained section that we get, but right here at 145 grams of thrust, we have this massive spike, this loss of efficiency up to about 160 watts. This is the desync, where the motor is coasting at this speed, so it's still making the same thrust, but the amp draw shoots through the roof, and so you can see the efficiency drop off right as the motor dies. And then we can also look at the temperature of the windings. So while this temperature, the max temperature that we hit on our oversized prop, is less than 60 degrees, which should be perfectly fine for the magnets, at least in this setup, we can anticipate that the actual temperatures that was reached inside was a lot higher. The temperature rise happened so quickly and in a small area, possibly not on the exact bit of winding that the thermistor was touching. But what we can see is how much faster the temperature rise is between the two props. So we do have a significant rise in temperature even on the normal prop, and we don't come to equilibrium in this short couple seconds test. The oversized prop is much sharper rise time. We've got to remember the full desync death is here at 6 seconds. So all of this heat that's going into it here was put into the motor in just these first 2 seconds here, and then this is just the temperature evening out and the being caught by the temperature sensor. So the actual temperature rise would be much faster than this.